I'm going to talk a little bit about Real Spy Comics. These are 3 titles that we either have or are working on. The interesting part of the origin story of Real Spy Comics is that I'm an intelligence officer in government speak. That means I'm a case officer. I collected intelligence. And Jan, who is my co-founder, was an FSB officer, and he tried to detect people like me, mostly Americans though. And so when we came together, we found we had a very different perspective on the same job. We could see both sides of the same story, and it made things quite interesting. And we've tried to incorporate that into our business moving forward. What I want to talk about in the next little bits comes from Jan's book, Almost American. Ron Martz is our editor-in-chief at Real Spy Comics. He's pretty famous in the comic book world for doing Green Lantern and a few other pretty interesting books. Bit of a pop star in the comic world, but just to recognize that that's where we've taken this from. This is a way that we can use comic books to show what intelligence is. So I'm going to talk today about human intelligence, which is the bit I know, also called espionage. On each of these slides, I've got a little snippet from Almost American, which kind of shows really some of the fundamental aspects of human. Everything I say today is unclassified. There's nothing secret about it. The general methodology I'm using is kind of a Western version, but there are, every country has a slightly different way of doing it. This is a kind of a generic version of espionage. The real secret to human is that it's a system. So it's a covert, that means secret relationship-based system, which is supported by research and is really based around trust. So the secret source of human intelligence is not technology, it's not fancy tradecraft, it's not all the stuff we see in the movies. It is basically building a relationship with another person in order to convince them and then protect them when they are stealing secrets from an organization that you're trying to get into. And the panel that we're showing here is something that I've actually heard for real, although my name's not Sarah, obviously. You're building this relationship with a person, which needs to appear to be genuine. In many cases it is, but often you become the protector, the sole friend, the sole confidant of the person you're talking to. And of course, whether you believe it or not, the person you're in the relationship with has to believe it. As we're developing a relationship with a potential source, there's 3 main parts that are what are being assessed by a case officer in every relationship meeting. So every time a case officer meets somebody who is a potential target to become a source, they're going through these 3 categories. First one is suitability, and that is the person fundamentally able to do the job you're asking them to do. So in this particular panel, we have a flashback. So this is Jan in the story flashing back to his grandfather in this case, who was a World War II hero. His whole family has served and had been part of the Russian intelligence community. His mother was in the KGB. Grandfather was in the Cheka and the NKVD. So for him, the concept of service was ingrained in him. So he has, this sense in his family. So strong family values of service, being able to follow a system of trust. Obviously, this requires observation and attention to detail when you're talking to someone. And there are a couple of red flags. You don't want people who are late. People want people who lie to you. You don't want people who are sloppy, generally speaking, because that's indications of a deeper unsuitability to do the job. The next one is access. And so with all kind of spying, you're trying to get to the center of the onion is the analogy we use. A couple of steps to get there. Now, the person you're talking to is probably not going to be the person who's at the center of the onion. They're likely to be someone who's a few steps away or close. But the idea is you're trying to get as close to the center of the onion as possible, and the onion being the core piece of intelligence that you need, the secret thing. Because if it's not secret, it's not worth going after for a human intelligence agency. So the key things you need to know about access is what can they do? How close can they get me? Can they actually do it? And so, you have to elicit the information. You have to be able to get them to tell you what they know and who they know. You also then have to verify it. So trust but verify is a very strong component to this. So you can see in the panels here, this is Jan talking as part of his debrief when he came to the US. He was basically saying he was the deputy chief of economic security, which is how the FSB were laundering money on behalf of the Russian state. I mean, that is really, really important, really valuable. And so this is where the system kicks in. So that typically then will get kicked back to analysts, a whole bunch of people behind the scenes who are going through all the different access, all the different types of intelligence to verify that information. The last and probably the most important part of human is getting a gauge of why a person would take our side and would betray their own. Now, this is a slight variation because in Jan's story, he made this decision by himself, and I'll talk about that in a second. But in offensive, proactive human intelligence case, you have to determine what is the reason. You have to elicit that from the person you're talking to, and there's usually more than one. They can be positive, they can be negative. In my experience, the positive ones are best. So patriotism, for instance, was a very strong motivation in a lot of cases that I had. It's very rarely something like venality. If someone is going to just do it for the money, then they're probably going to sell it to somebody else as well. So you want to make sure that they're just giving it to you and that they're, able to operate securely. So money is essentially, often you want to tie the relationship to money. You want to turn it into a transaction. And that's important in the Western form of human intelligence so that you can hand over the case to your successor in your posting or wherever you are. But money is often tied, if that is the motivation, it's often tied to something else like family security or education for the kids or stability, those kind of things. So if it can be made positive, then that's more important. Now, in this case, we've got a couple of panels here which sort of show the types of motivations, if I had met Jan and was trying to recruit him directly, that I would have been looking at. So we already know from here, he enjoyed the kickbacks. He enjoyed the game. He liked all the fine things. And he still does. Has a nice watch. We used to have a nice watch. He really enjoyed that part of it. And, that's a pretty common thing. But more importantly, and this is on the right-hand side, is Jan is a patriot. He still is a Russian patriot, which can be challenging sometimes, but totally understandable. What he didn't like was the fact that when he was inside the system wasn't doing what it was supposed to be doing. He was supposed to be laundering money in order to support economic security, in order to fund FSB operations. And what he found is that the funding was actually going to support Putin himself, to the oligarchs, and to Russian organized crime. And that didn't sit well with him. It didn't sit well with his understanding of the state, of what he wanted Russia to be. And the core of his motivations, this is the strongest one, which is about his boss. And this is also one that's exploitable and usable, and often is this sense that you're not valued in the workplace. You're not liked, you're not respected. The things that you say are not being listened to. And if the person you're talking to feels like you're the person who's listening to you and that they can have an impact through you, well, then that's a really useful motivation. So this is the thing that takes the most time. And so a recruitment process can be quick. It could be a walk up, someone's done the work for you, and as the case officer, you're the talking head, and you go and deliver it in a one meeting. But more often than not, it's a slow cultivation that takes time, takes effort, constant meetings, constant awareness of your digital profile, your pattern of life, etc., etc. And just to sort of finish off on Jan, why did he defect from Russia? Why did he come to the US and have this life which is in many ways less than his life in Russia? The real reason is because he's an honorable man and he loves his country and he loves his family. And when presented with the option to either continue taking the bribes or to kill himself, he took the third option and left the country. And so it's actually a real honor for me to work with someone like Jan who has that very principled stance. Quick, like where we're going to next with Real Spy Comics, so telling more of these stories, like making them more accessible to people. The next story we're telling, and this is, you can see where we are up in the production, we're a little bit further than this now, almost finished, is the story of Chris Costa, who is the executive director of the International Spy Museum in Washington, D.C. This is a really important story to tell because it represents a lot of people's experience with intelligence work, but also for us, it shows how we go through the process. So this is the next story we're working on currently in production, and this is a story about a country redacted case officer stationed in Bangkok working with the Thai intelligence services. And through the story, the case officer has to infiltrate or has to start training in Muay Thai in order to recruit a Muay Thai fighter to infiltrate a criminal gang that was supplying a whole bunch of criminal services to terrorist groups and drug dealers and that kind of stuff. Just a bit more of a diverse story outside of the US, but pretty interesting nonetheless. Obviously, in a fixed format, it's interesting, but it gets even more interesting when you can start having people be the player, be the person, you're in the game. And so there is a real tight synergy between telling these stories and then being able to play these stories, either as the primer for it or as the thing which is an example of how it was done.